It's 6 p.m. here in London. This is The World Today with me, Karen Giannoni. The British Prime Minister and the French President agree a pilot scheme to return migrants to France who've tried to cross the English Channel in small boats.
We simply cannot solve a challenge like stopping the boats by acting alone and telling our allies that we won't play ball. That is why today's agreement is so important.
These are strong decisions, new decisions, deep decisions that we've been taking to fight against these networks and this irregular migration to enable the safety and security in both our countries.
The two leaders also discussed support for Ukraine, calling for increased pressure on Vladimir Putin to secure a ceasefire. At least 52 people have been killed by Israeli strikes in Gaza, with hospital officials saying some of the victims were queuing for children's nutritional supplements. Also coming up on The World Today, we'll be live in Texas, where rescue workers are continuing to search through the wreckage left behind by the devastating floods there. Welcome to The World Today, an hour of international news from the BBC. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have unveiled details of a plan to tackle undocumented migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats. On the last day of the French President's state visit to London, Sir Keir called the agreement a groundbreaking scheme that will deter others from trying to make the same journey.
So I'm pleased to announce our agreement today on a groundbreaking returns pilot. For the very first time, migrants arriving via small boat will be detained and returned to France in short order. In exchange for every return, a different individual will be allowed to come here via a safe route, controlled and legal, subject to strict security checks, and only open to those who have not tried to enter the UK illegally.
Well, President Macron of France also maintained that Brexit was a key factor behind the immigration challenges.
It's since Brexit that the UK no longer has any migratory agreement with the EU. So for people wanting to cross, there is no legal admission way, nor a way of sending people back after a crossing. And this creates, and this is a pull factor to attempt the crossing, exactly the inverse effect of what Brexit promised.
Well, the refugee charity Care for Calais called it a grubby deal between two governments that trades human lives. The two leaders gave a news conference in London at the end of Mr Macron's three-day state visit, the first by a European Union political leader since Brexit. Earlier in the day, the pair co-chaired a summit with countries of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, looking at plans to support Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. As part of that summit, they signed the Northwood Declaration, which would allow the UK and France to coordinate their nuclear deterrence for the first time. They also announced increased military cooperation. A joint deployable force is to be expanded fivefold to 50,000 troops. Meanwhile, more than 200 migrants have been picked up in the English Channel today. The BBC filmed video of people disembarking from a border force boat in Dover on the south coast of England. Earlier, the Coast Guard told the BBC it coordinated the response to the multiple incidents involving small boats in the Channel. Let's talk about what's being announced and what's been happening. Our political correspondent Ian Watson is in Westminster, and our correspondent Tom Simons is in Dover on the south coast. Tom, to you first, just tell us what's been happening there.
Well, look, it's a red day, as the government puts it, a day when it's quite easy to come across this body of water. The sea is flat, there's very little wind. We can actually see France so clearly over there that the migrants know this, and they know that it's a good day for them to try to get across. And across they have been coming. We have had two border force vessels packed with migrants arrive here at Dover at a base just down there where they come to the UK, and 2 lifeboats which don't always get used to pick people out of the sea but have been used on this occasion. And there are still people unloading or coming off the boats below me. We've seen a family with very small children. One child, a colleague here through a long lens could see, was visibly distressed. It is a dangerous way to come to this country, and they are still coming, and the numbers have been increasing this year compared to last year.
And Ian, to you in Westminster, in the light of the situation that Tom is describing day after day down on the coast, what has been announced today and how would it work?
Well, what's been announced today is a pilot scheme. Pilot scheme probably means that it's not extensive initially, although the government has been pretty much tight-lipped on the kind of numbers that this would involve. But essentially, this is what's been called a one-in, one-out deal. So people who've come here in small boats would be returned to France, and an equal number of people in France who are legitimate asylum seekers, perhaps seeking family reunion in the United Kingdom, would come in this direction. They would come to the UK. Now, that looks as though that makes no overall difference to the figures crossing the Channel or the figures for illegal migration, but the hope of both President Macron and the Prime Minister is this would act as a deterrent effect, because some people making that dangerous journey across the Channel would know that in effect they'd be given an involuntary return ticket, and that journey would have been completely risky but without any benefit whatsoever. So they would hope that that would deter them in the long run. Other people would be allowed into the UK by legitimate means. The idea is then also to act as a deterrent to people who are coming into Europe in the first place and then making that journey across Europe to the Channel. According to President Macron, around 1/3 of migrants who've come into Europe are bound for the UK. So that is basically what they're after, but it is a pilot scheme for a number of reasons. First of all, there are other countries in the EU that are not keen on this at all. They're worried that if people go back to France from the UK, they might then be sent back to their initial point of entry, to Italy or Spain, for example. So they are raising their objections with the European Commission. Secondly, it is only a pilot, so we're not quite sure how success will be measured and whether the numbers really will ramp up as the Prime Minister hopes they do.
Ian, thank you. Tom, back to you. I mean, you mentioned that these figures are record-breaking for this year. Just talk us through the numbers so far. We're only in July.
Well, Linda, let me just give you this 1 week. So in the last, I think, 8 days, we started at the beginning of today with 695 people coming to the UK in small boats across the Channel. That's quite a low number, actually. Some of the worst days of this have seen more than 1,000 people coming. And these boats, supposed to hold about 20 people, sometimes hold 50 or 60 people crowded on. So that's the beginning of the day. We think we've probably seen 300, maybe 400 people coming across, and it's not over yet. As I said, there are still people who are coming off the lifeboat that's down in the harbour behind me. And you can be sure that if there's another red day when the conditions are good tomorrow, there will be more people on the beaches, probably planning their route across now for tomorrow morning. So that's really what the government, both sides of the Channel, the two governments, are up against.
Tom, thanks very much. Tom Simons there down on the coast in Watson, here in London, in Westminster. Thank you both. Now, we've been getting a range of responses since the deal was announced in the last couple of hours. The leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, gave his thoughts on the immigration challenges.
There is a massive global problem, but why don't we, and the reason we voted Brexit, why don't we make sure we don't make the same mistakes as the European Union and many others?
But you don't think we need to work with other countries on this?
No, we don't need to work. The European Union have a stupid policy that I warned in 2015 would lead to millions coming. It has. Why should we pay for their problem? We voted in a referendum to leave their problem.
Let's talk to Tony Smith, who is the former head of the UK Border Force and a former government advisor on immigration legislation. Tony Smith, thank you for being with us. What do you think of this?
I think the jury's still out, to be honest. I mean, the devil will be in the detail. He's right to say this is groundbreaking in that, in my experience, and I worked in the Home Office for a great many years on arrangements for returns of asylum seekers. It's the first time that we've ever been able to persuade France to take back failed asylum seekers. I don't think it's anything to do with Brexit, therefore, because they weren't taking them back when we were in the EU. Now they're saying they're going to take some back. But the figures that I've heard being bruited were 50 a week, which is about 2,500 a year, weighed against 44,000 crossings last year. So if you do the maths, that it's more like 17 in and 1 out.
Yes, I was looking at those figures, 21,000 arrivals in small boats in the first 6 months of this year alone. How does this 1 in, 1 out theory benefit anybody?
Well, the idea is that, you know, if we start to detain people when they come off the boats in Dover and we start to send them back to France, then we send a message across the channel that you don't need to come anymore because you're going to end up back where you started from. But the difficulty with that is if we're only going to be detaining a very small percentage, 6%, then the other 94% are going to continue to come through as they do now, aren't they? And we'll end up in the UK, in the asylum system, and in quite a lot of them in a hotel. So if you're trying to deter migrants from making the crossing, this is a step in the right direction, perhaps not a big enough step. There may be other things that we're going to need to do to discourage them from crossing.
What other things do you have in mind?
Well, I was a fan of the Rwanda plan that this government abolished before it even got off the ground, but that would have enabled us to do the same thing with people coming off the boats in Dover, but send them directly to Rwanda. And they could stay there and they could claim asylum there and they would not be sent back to the country they were fearing persecution from. That deal was done, but unfortunately it never really got off the ground because it was declared illegal by a number of legal challenges over 2 or 3 years. And so it never happened. But I think we can't, we need to know we can't control what the French do. We can't control what the EU do. We can control what we do. And if we can come to an agreement where we start to see people being removed from this country as illegal entrants when they arrive, then that might be the message we're looking for. But I think without that removal as deterrent, this particular deal isn't going to go far enough, as far as I can see at the moment.
Tony Smith, former head of the UK Border Force and former government advisor on immigration legislation, thank you for your thoughts. Well, the two leaders have also been discussing support for Ukraine. Kyiv came under renewed attack again overnight, with yet more Russian drones and missiles falling on the Ukrainian capital. At least 2 people were killed, 13 others injured. Russia said the strike had targeted military industrial enterprises in Kyiv as well as air bases. Speaking after a meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, attended virtually by Volodymyr Zelensky, Sir Keir Starmer said European plans for a peacekeeping force to aid Ukraine once the war ends are mature after months of planning. Emmanuel Macron also said there's a determination to support Ukraine, describing their virtual summit as a show of unity. Well, it came as Ukraine's president was in Rome with European allies for a conference about reconstruction. President Zelensky says the leaders talked about air defences and more investment in weapons production and highlighted what he called very constructive and very positive conversations with President Trump. And meanwhile, the US Secretary of State says he told his Russian counterpart that Washington was disappointed and frustrated with the lack of progress in peace talks. Marco Rubio met Sergei Lavrov at the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Well, with me is Russia editor at BBC Monitoring and Ukrainecast presenter Vitaly Shevchenko. How much hope has there been in this meeting between President Macron and Keir Starmer over more security for Ukraine?
Well, they made the right noises. They said the things that Volodymyr Zelensky and the people of Ukraine are really going to like. Things like the Coalition of the Willing is determined to keep helping Ukraine. It's reconfirmed plans to give Ukraine at least $40 billion in aid by the end of this year. So that's good. And after the Ukraine Recovery Conference held in Rome, we have got a better understanding of which way things are going as far as helping Ukraine is concerned. Volodymyr Zelensky was giving a news conference just now, actually, after that event, and he said Ukraine and its partners are now looking to purchase key air defense systems, for example, that Ukraine desperately needs. Patriot, US-made Patriot air defense systems. He said Ukraine wants 10 hugely expensive additional Patriot systems from America. And Ukraine apparently has agreement with Germany, so that Germany pays for 2 of those systems, Norway another system, and the other 7, he's confident that Ukraine and its partners would be able to find money for those as well. So buying them instead of being donated them. Also, there's been discussion about joint production of weapons for Ukraine, particularly drones, particularly interceptor drones, and that's a relatively new thing being deployed in Ukraine. Apparently it's working very well, Ukrainian drones intercepting Russian drones. So agreement has been reached with Ukraine's partners to jointly invest and produce those drones. The big elephant in the room, if you like, was America, where things are going with America. And Volodymyr Zelensky, he sounded positive. He said he had very constructive conversations with Donald Trump, and speaking about the latest pauses and interruptions, reported interruptions to American weapons supplies to Ukraine, he said, and I'm sure he chose his words really carefully, he said Ukraine now has all the right signals to make sure these supplies resume, and now Ukrainian and American teams are working to ensure that all those weapons are in Ukraine on time.
Very briefly, Vitaly, I mean, this has been a week that we've heard Donald Trump as frustrated as we have ever heard him with Vladimir Putin. We heard Marco Rubio's meeting with Sergei Lavrov resulted in a frank exchange of views. That sounds strong. What are Ukrainians thinking about that?
It's new. It's a new thing. There's a glimmer of hope. But what I've seen being discussed in the Ukrainian media is that we believe it when you see it, because words are just not enough at this stage.
Vitaly, thank you very much. Vitaly Shevchenko of BBC Monitoring. Around the world and across the UK, this is The World Today on BBC News. Gaza's civil defense agency says Israeli strikes have killed at least 52 Palestinians since midnight throughout the Gaza Strip. A hospital said in one attack, 15 people were killed, including 2 women and 8 children, while they were queuing for nutritional supplements at a medical point. Video from the hospital in Deir al-Balah showed the bodies of several children and others lying on the floor as medics treated their wounds. The Israeli military has admitted the strike, saying it was targeting a fighter involved in the October the 7th attacks and regrets harm to uninvolved individuals. The children's charity UNICEF says it's appalled by the killings of Palestinians who are waiting in line for nutritional supplies for children in Deir al-Balah. There have been graphic images coming out of Gaza. Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify has more details on what we've been finding out.
We've seen really graphic video of several children who've been killed on a road. Now, we've blurred it because it is so graphic, but in the video you can hear wailing and screaming in the background as the camera pans around to show you the very distressing scene. Now, it's been reported that at least 15 Palestinians have been killed, including 8 children and 2 women. That's according to Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Gaza. Now, it's reported that the people were waiting for nutritional supplements in the town of Deir el-Balah. Now, we've located that video to this point in Deir el-Balah in central Gaza. Now, in another video we've seen, we can see those bodies of those children killed at the scene, some of them covered in blood, being carted away to the nearby hospital. Now, we've also verified this CCTV footage that emerged on social media earlier today, which shows 2 men walking and then an explosion. This is as close as 6 meters away from the children who've been killed. Now, we're not showing you the moment of death, but one munitions expert we spoke to said this was consistent with a Mikolit bomb. That's a munition commonly employed by Israeli drones. The Israeli army said they'd struck a Hamas fighter in the area on Thursday, who they say took part in the October 7th attacks. Now, the Israeli army have said they're aware of reports regarding a number of injured individuals in the area, and they added that the incident was under review and said they regret any harm to uninvolved individuals. Now, this deadly incident follows a series of killings of Palestinians waiting for aid and food supplies across Gaza, which have been repeatedly blamed on Israeli fire by Gazan officials and eyewitnesses.
That's Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify. There could be 6 million new HIV infections and 4 million more AIDS-related deaths globally by 2029 as a result of the sweeping cuts Donald Trump made to US support. The UN today released a new report on global infection rates, the first we've had since those cutbacks took effect. South Africa, which has the highest infection rates, will be the country most severely affected. It's home to some of the world-leading HIV research, which in part was dependent on this US funding. Our Africa correspondent Mayeni Jones is in Johannesburg and sent this report.
A lifeline for thousands. This private clinic in northern Johannesburg used to receive USAID funding. We visited when the cuts were first announced. And some of its patients were anxious about their impact.
Firstly, when I was sick without the clinic or attending the clinic, my life was so bad. Since I get the treatment from Witkoppen Clinic, I'm fine. I'm fine. There is no problem about me.
What would you say to Americans who say that American taxpayers shouldn't be paying for healthcare in South Africa?
No. That is not a good idea. We are all human beings. They mustn't separate. This is Africa, this is America. Please.
Although this clinic is still open, dozens have closed their doors. Scientists here are warning this could lead to a spike in infections. The public health system is stretched and can't absorb all the patients who used to get their care from USAID-funded initiatives. And Frontline Healthcare isn't the only affected area. These scientists are working on a vaccine for HIV, but most of their funding came from the US. When President Trump pulled the plug, they managed to secure some emergency funds, but it won't be enough.
When the stop order came, that meant we had to stop everything, and it's only been some of us who've been able to get additional funding that we could continue.
How disruptive was that interruption?
Extremely disruptive. It's set us back months, probably could even be a year or so.
The benefit of developing and testing vaccines on the continent is that it makes them cheaper. Following the US funding cuts, some of this work may now have to be completed in the US or in Europe, where vaccine trials are more expensive. This might mean that any vaccine that's developed could be unaffordable. Many of the developments in HIV prevention, which have benefited patients around the world, were trialled here in South Africa. Now the country's researchers say they need emergency funding if this work is to continue.
South African researchers were the ones who did the pivotal trials on a lot of these treatment regimens, a lot of the HIV prevention tools and drugs, but we're not on top of HIV yet. We're only managing HIV, we're not preventing HIV. So it's still there. We still need a vaccine against HIV, and that's where we need to continue doing research.
The South African government and international donors have pledged some $54 million to plug some of the US funding cuts. But given that last year the Americans spent $450 million on HIV funding to South Africa, this bailout won't be enough to cover the need. This could have devastating consequences for global health. Maini Jones, BBC News, Johannesburg.
The UK faces a rising threat from Iran and the government must do more to counter it. That's what Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee has warned. The report looked at evidence up to August 2023 and raised particular concern over a sharp increase in physical threats against opponents of Iran's regime in the UK. The Iranian embassy in London has rejected the report's findings as biased and baseless. Now, in the last couple of hours, the original Hermes Birkin bag, which was owned by the late Jane Birkin herself, has been sold for €8.5 million at an auction in Paris. And that's the moment the bidding stopped as the staggering price smashed records. Now, the handbag was first designed for Ms. Birkin in 1984, and there have been many copies of it made since, but none as valuable, of course, as this one. Now, let's just remind you what's been happening. In the last couple of hours, we've heard that announcement by President Macron of France, who's being hosted by the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, of that deal over migration. It's a one-in, one-out policy. They unveiled this deal intended to curb channel crossings in small boats by migrants. Keir Starmer explained it, saying that migrants arriving on small boats will be returned to France in exchange for asylum seekers who haven't tried to enter the UK illegally, and that is designed as a deterrent to people who want to make the crossing. That's President Macron there at Downing Street. He will be departing very soon after this three-day state visit. You're with BBC News. I'm Karen Giannoni. The headlines. The British Prime Minister and the French President have agreed a pilot scheme to return migrants to France who've tried to cross the English Channel in small boats.
We simply cannot solve a challenge like stopping the boats by acting alone and telling our allies that we won't play ball. That is why today's agreement is so important.
These are strong decisions, new decisions, deep decisions that we've been taking to fight against these networks and this irregular migration to enable the safety and security in both our countries.
The two leaders also discussed support for Ukraine, calling for increased pressure on Vladimir Putin to secure a ceasefire in Ukraine. At least 52 people have been killed by Israeli strikes in Gaza, with hospital officials saying some of the victims were queuing for children's nutritional supplements. Search teams are continuing to work through the wreckage of the devastating floods in Texas, nearly a week after torrential rains hit the area around Hill Country towards the centre of the state. Authorities say at least 120 people are known to have died. More than 170 people are still missing. Last Friday, the 4th of July, more than a foot of rain fell in less than an hour. President Trump is due to visit the disaster zone tomorrow. Well, let's go live to my colleague, Carl Nassman, who's in Ingram in Texas. Carl, how is it going there?
Those search efforts are continuing, and I think it's important just to get a sense of what the president's going to be seeing in terms of the scale of the damage here. And you can see behind me right here one example of just how powerful those floodwaters were. This is a car. This has just been completely folded up and destroyed. You can see here where the gas tank was, a peek back here in the back seat of the car. The front just completely collapsed, and of course the hope is that nobody was inside that vehicle at the time. This also does show you the scale of what these search teams are really going to be combing through over the next few days, looking for those some 170 people that are still missing. We're actually with a crew that's doing that exact difficult work. I'm with Joe Rogalski. He's the founder of Upstream International. You've been out here almost since the storm hit. Just tell us, what are the conditions like here? How difficult is it now to continue looking for all these people that are unaccounted for?
Yeah, it's like anybody has a job, so after a while it's just what you're supposed to do. So whenever you show up to these catastrophic events, it's picking apart what's the first thing to do. So whether you're the first to arrive or the last to leave, the people become the highest priority. So what you're seeing is just an ongoing process of trying to look for those that are missing.
Walk us through that process, because we're in day 7 now. You're using some pretty specialized equipment. You're also using sniffer dogs. How is that helping you to try to maybe track down some of the people that loved ones are desperately wanting to find?
Yeah, the hardest workers out here by far are the dogs. They can just cover ground that we can't. They have senses that we don't have. So the process is really, it's 3 stages. So this particular piece that we're on right now is in the 2nd stage. So you have manual people walking, horse teams, divers that cruise the waters, and you're looking for anything visible. So like this car, for example, it has a visible inspection, broken windows, you look inside, and then you clear that. Then what comes through next is your dogs.
Joe, talk to me about the scale that you're working on here. This is, during normal times, not a very big river. It became huge during the flash floods, and I understand that, your teams and other teams and volunteers are working 10, 20, 30, even 40 miles downstream.
Yeah, I come from the Midwest where rivers have water in them. So here in Texas, rivers are often dried up creek beds. So the water basin here almost stretches a half mile, but it is typically dry. So you have 50, 60 yards of moving water. And just days ago, I don't know if you guys have had a pan, but these cypress trees that you're seeing, you can see the water line is almost 20 feet above. So what is now dry ground just days ago was 108,000 cubic feet per second of moving water.
What happens next? It's such a difficult process. We've seen crews out here in that Texas heat working 12, 14-hour days. How can that effort and this search effort be sustained at this point?
Yeah, I work on the island of Haiti, so it's Menampil Shai Palu. So it's just many hands make light work. It's an old proverb, but first glance, everything is very overwhelming. But each person in their trade knows exactly what their job is to do and when next. So it's kind of a stand and wait for clearance. And right now, like I said, you add human lives to the component, and it changes everything. So people don't want to start moving trees and cars and stuff like that until everyone is found. So trees cleanup happens, but right now our primary focus is the people. So in all that divides us today, I think tragedy unifies us. Everybody can come here without and push their differences aside and know what their job and task is, and you do it until you're done.
Just briefly, you've been doing this kind of work for a long time, some 17 years. How does what you're seeing here in Texas compare?
Each storm, like a fingerprint, it's different, but they have similarities. Tornadoes and things like floods, you tend to have a parameter. So an earthquake is very different, but a storm, we know that we have a river basin, we know how high the water went, and we know the length and duration. So it really is just fine-tooth combing each part and piece. And you had asked a question a second ago. People forget that when we're out here, a person's prayer matters, a bottle of water that's brought to you matters, a meal matters. So I think the instinct to help is an urgent one in response, but don't be afraid to fill an actual need. I was sharing last night, we do unto others what we would hope somebody would do for us. In these situations, you have to ask, what can I do? Actually ask the question, what is it that you need me to do? There's a part and a role, but sometimes it's not what you showed up with.
Joe Rogelski with Upstream International, the founder of that volunteer group. We thank you for your time. We thank you for all the work you've been doing, and this really isn't easy work. There's some 2,000 volunteers actually across this area here in Texas doing very similar work. And, the hopes right now of finding anybody alive, of course, have really begun to fade at this point. But volunteers like Joe still doing it, still out here searching because of all those families of some 170 people. They want that kind of closure. They want to be able to recover their loved ones if that is possible. So a big task, really stretching miles up and down this Guadalupe River.
Yeah, Carl, thanks very much. Such a lot of hard work going on there. Carl Nassman in Texas. We're increasingly dependent on computer processors holding AI systems, data and cloud storage. But that seemingly limitless resource lives in over 10,000 giant data centres around the world. Most of them are located in the US, some here in Europe, in the UK and in Germany. And they are thirsty both for energy and for water. Yesterday, Nvidia, the chip maker that powers much of the AI revolution, became the first $4 trillion company, which tells you the growth and the demand for these services is increasing exponentially. But what does that mean for the environment and those living close to these centres? Our North America business correspondent, Michelle Fleury, has been to the US state of Georgia to find out.
Okay, so I am going to pour this into the tank.
For Beverly Morris, this has become part of her daily routine.
The water won't come through the water lines to fill the toilet tank, so I have to fill it with a bucket of water. It's plugged with sediment.
She bought her home in Mansfield, Georgia in 2016, drawn by the peace, the trees, the seclusion. That changed when a massive Meta data center moved in next door. Now she buys all her drinking water.
No one should have to be afraid to drink their water. Not in this day, not in this age. I'm going to fill it up with some water.
Since construction began, her well has turned murky. The sediment you see, that's from her taps, and she says it wasn't there before. We contacted Meta. Facebook's parent company told us being a good neighbour is a priority, but that this had nothing to do with them. They commissioned a study which found its data centre operation did not adversely affect groundwater conditions in the area. Still, Beverly isn't reassured.
This was my perfect spot before, but it isn't anymore.
The rise of AI means more data and more data centres to handle it. These digital workhorses use huge amounts of power and water to stay cool and discharge wastewater in the process. What's happening right here in Georgia could provide a window into a global trend, one that might affect the UK. As these high-tech hubs multiply, they are putting a strain on local water supplies, a pressure that's unlikely to slow down anytime soon. And that's because of our increasingly AI-powered tech habits.
Literally anything that you do today on your computer, your mobile devices, the apps you use, they're mostly powered by data centers.
And while Meta disputes that it has caused the problems with Beverly's water, there's no doubt the company has worn out its welcome as her neighbour. Michelle Fleury, BBC News, Mansfield, Georgia.
A provocative new documentary out in cinemas this week called Apocalypse in the Tropics looks at the role of conservative evangelical Christians in helping to elect politicians in Brazil and the United States. It raises the idea that in both countries there should be a move to theocracy in the future. The documentary comes from the Brazilian filmmaker Petra Costa. Emma Jones has been to meet her.
Presidents Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva may be the current Brazilian president, but the focus of filmmaker Petra Costa's new documentary, Apocalypse in the Tropics, is on his predecessor Jair Bolsonaro. The claim is made that the fire of religious zeal could one day burn up secular politics in Brazil. She looks at how vital the support of evangelical Christians was to Bolsonaro's election campaign. The populist politician was president of Brazil from 2019 till 2022. While evangelicals still only make up a quarter of Brazil's population, Brazilian-born Costa says she discovered while filming a previous movie that some had hopes to transform the country.
I arrived in the Brazilian Congress during the impeachment crisis that we had in 2016, and I found a group of evangelical men and women blessing the seats of congressmen. And the pastor who was leading the ceremony, I asked him, what is going to happen to Brazilian democracy? And he answered, well, God will take over, will take the reins of government and determine the future, and the unbelievers will fall.
She argues with, even as she films, a prominent pastor, Silas Malafaia, who credits himself with helping Bolsonaro to power.
Isso é democracia.
Mas democracia não é só a vontade da maioria, né? Também a proteção das minorias.
Costa explores the long tradition of evangelicals involved in politics in the USA. Support from the church-going Christian right for President Trump to implement a socially conservative agenda was important for his election twice. But Costa notes that the current president, a socialist known mainly as Lula, has been publicly prayed for and says she's concerned that Brazil is now mirroring America's religious path.
These phenomena that happened from the 50s to 70s in the United States only began in Brazil in the 2010. So when I was watching this material of the evangelical movement into politics in America, it felt like I was looking at myself in the mirror. Like, how could this country do exactly what we were doing so many years before?
The director's parallels between the USA and Brazil are emphasised when she films as Bolsonaro supporters, including Christians, ransack the Brazilian Congress building in protest at him losing the 2022 election. The images evoke the storming of the US Capitol building the year before in an attempt by some Trump supporters to stop a Biden presidency. Costa says she hopes her movie will help Americans think about the potential consequences of religious beliefs influencing political decisions.
The first nation to invent the separation between church and state is now so quickly eroding it inside their own country, and Brazil and the United States could become a theocracy. Many people won't agree with me. Will say I'm being very pessimistic.
Ultimately, in this film, Costa is asking for faith, but it's faith in secular democracy that she hopes for. Emma Jones, BBC News.
The right. Around the world and across the UK, this is The World Today on BBC News.